Hi, Professor Navarro here again. In this third lecture, we're going to probe behind the curtain of the demand curve. We'll do that by learning more about consumer behavior and how consumers choose the products they do. In the process, I will introduce you to important new concepts such as cardinal versus ordinal utility, diminishing marginal utility, and demand price elasticities. These concepts will help us to better understand why the demand curve slopes downward and why the demand curve sometimes shifts. We will also come to solve at least one puzzle I told you about earlier, why increasing the price of a product may not always result in higher profits for a firm or business.
Lecture 3. Demand and Consumer Behavior.
In the early days of automobile manufacturing, Henry Ford was reported to have said of his Model T car, "Give them any color they want, so long as it's black." Well, we've certainly come a long way since Ford's day, at least when it comes to consumer choice. Indeed, today's consumers can choose from a dizzying assortment of goods and services in the marketplace in virtually every industry, from autos and computers to sneakers and bikinis. The question, of course, is how do consumers go about making their choices? And the concept of individual choice is one of the most important in economics. In fact, the great economist Stanley Jevons once said, "The theory of economics must begin with the correct theory of consumption." So why do people do what they do? While psychologists and philosophers have many complex answers to that question, economists believe that, for the most part, we do what we do and we buy what we buy because it makes us feel good. And while some may argue that this selfish motive lacks any of the milk of human kindness that sets humans apart from the apes, it is nonetheless hard to disagree with the idea that a lot of our behavior is indeed driven by self-interest. Using this simple method of self-interest, consumer choice boils down to three things: the pleasure people get from consuming a good, the price they have to pay for it, and the income or budget available to them to exercise their choices. So how do you measure pleasure? It's a good question, and the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham and his followers thought they had an answer back in the 1800s. Bentham proposed that society should be organized on the principle of utility, which he defined as the property in any object to produce pleasure, good, or happiness, or to prevent pain, evil, or unhappiness. To Bentham, all legislation should be designed on utilitarian principles to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number, and Bentham's followers took him quite literally. They believed that scientists would eventually invent a machine that could measure pleasure by measuring brainwaves. They even developed a measure of pleasure they called the util. For example, a big juicy sirloin steak for dinner might give a person 1,000 utils, while a plate of Spam might yield only 100 utils. And if economists were able to take such measurements with some utilimeter, they'd have what is called a cardinal measure of utility, meaning that utility could be measured in actual numbers. This would make it very easy to explain consumer behavior. Of course, nobody yet has come up with a utilimeter. Instead, in their efforts to explain consumer choice, economists have settled for an ordinal measure of utility. An ordinal measure simply ranks goods relative to one another. Thus, you could say you like peas better than broccoli, and you like ice cream better than both of those vegetables, but you don't really need to say by how much to rank your preferences for these goods. Now, having debunked the existence of a cardinal utility, it will be nonetheless very convenient for me now to assume that we can, in fact, actually use numbers to measure utility. This is a favorite trick of economists. Make a simplifying assumption to explain a complex point. In this case, I'm going to explain the difference between total utility and marginal utility and show how the utility maximizing rule, or equimarginal principle, allows us to derive the downward sloping demand curve. But just remember as I do this that our use of actual numbers is only for simplicity. So let's take a look at this table. It shows the quantity of music concerts consumed, Q, and the total utility or pleasure, U, that Phil, our music connoisseur, would gain from that consumption. Note that as consumption increases from 0 to 5, utility increases from 0 to 10. Now let's use this table to derive the marginal utility. It is simply the additional utility that Phil would derive from a 1 unit increase in consumption. So if Phil moves from 0 to 1 concert and total utility increases from 0 to 4, what's Phil's marginal utility? That's right, it's 4. Now, how about if Phil increases his consumption by 1 more concert to 2? What is the marginal utility now? The answer is 3, which we get by subtracting 4 from 7. Now take a minute to fill in the marginal utilities in the rest of the table. Did you get it right? Note that in this third column, the marginal utility steadily falls as consumption rises. This reflects the law of diminishing marginal utility, and it is one of the most important concepts in economics. Think of it this way. Suppose you go to a restaurant and have duck orange with wild rice. It might taste pretty good, and you might even be hungry after eating it. Even so, if the waiter brings a second serving of the duck, it probably won't taste as good as the first. And if you had to eat a third serving, it probably wouldn't taste very good at all. Apparently, sometimes you can get too much of a good thing. Now here's another table, this one for the utility associated with eating pizza slices. Take a minute to graph on a piece of paper both the total utility and marginal utility curves with the quantity of pizza on the horizontal axis. Do your figures look like these? Note that the downward slope of the marginal utility curve in the right-hand figure is reflected in the total utility curve being bowed downward in the left-hand figure. This bowed shape, in turn, reflects the idea that total utility increases with consumption, but does so at a decreasing rate. In other words, there is diminishing marginal utility.